Hi and welcome to section 3.6 for Econ 2 on the AQA exam board. Today we're going to be looking at the balance of payments. The balance of payments measures the financial transactions made between consumers, businesses and governments in one country with consumers, businesses and governments in another country. The balance of payment is composed of three separate parts. The first part is the current account, the second part is the capital account, and the final part is the official financing account. With the balance of payments, the key is to follow where the money is going. Inflows of foreign currency are a positive entry for the balance of payments. An export will be a positive entry for the balance of payments because the goods and services are flowing abroad and foreign currency is flowing back in exchange for these goods and services. Money that is leaving an economy is a negative for the balance of payments, and this could be an import. This is because domestic currency is having to leave the economy to pay for these goods and services. For AS Economics, you are only required to know about the current account, which is the first part of the balance of payments. The current account is made up of many different sections, one of which is the trade in goods. This includes imports and exports of goods that are either finished or semi-finished, and the import and exports of commodities. The next section is trade in services. These are any traded services such as financial services, consulting, or tourism. The current account is also made up by primary income, which is income from investments and employment in a foreign country. Investment income is any income that has been made abroad. This includes profits from business activities of subsidiaries located abroad, interest from UK financial investments and loan abroad, and dividends from owning shares overseas. Payments to workers who are resident of a country but employed in another country are also included in the current account. Secondary income are transfers. These are gifts between countries, such as donations to charities abroad and overseas aid. If a country is receiving aid or a donation, it counts as a positive on the current account. If they are given a donation or overseas aid, it counts as a negative on the current account. So after summing up all the entries in the current account and the other two sections of the balance of payments, we get a figure for the balance of payments. But what does this figure actually mean? A positive figure is a surplus, and this is when exports are larger than imports. A surplus will be where more money is coming into a country than is leaving. This results in gold and other currency stocks increasing. The country can then use this excess money to pay off its existing debts it may have to financial institutions in another country. A deficit is a negative figure for the balance of payment, and this indicates that a country is importing more than they are exporting. With a deficit, more money is leaving a country than is coming in. This results in the country having to sell gold or its holdings of other currencies. Alternatively, they could borrow from other central banks, such as the European Central Bank, or other organisations such as the IMF. But are surpluses or deficits for the balance of payment bad? Both are bad if they are persistent and they form a large part of GDP. If a deficit forms a large part of GDP, then it means that an economy is susceptible to price increases from abroad. If a surplus is a large part of GDP, then it means that a country's economy will be unbalanced, and if there was to be a fall in demand for their exports, then their economy could be in serious trouble. This is because a fall in the demand for exports would cause aggregate demand to shift inwards, and this could lead the economy to be in an equilibrium where there is a negative output gap. This would mean that factors of production in that economy may be unemployed and not used. This would increase the unemployment rate. Furthermore, whether a surplus or a deficit is bad is dependent on how much the central bank has in its reserves. China is a country that has a massive balance of payments surplus. This has resulted in China building huge reserves of American dollars, which may not be sustainable in the long run. A country that has a deficit may run out of its foreign exchange reserves if the deficit is consistent. Governments and central banks should monitor the balance of payments, but a slightly positive or a negative figure for the balance of payments should not be too much of a concern, provided that these figures are not persistent. There are many factors that influence the balance of payments, and we're going to work our way through some of them now. One is inflation. If inflation in a country is high, then it makes goods and services more expensive. This makes exports from this country less competitive, and thus the demand for exports falls. The decrease in demand for exports would push the balance of payments into a deficit, or increase the deficit, or reduce the surplus. The balance of payments figure would reduce. Another factor that influences the balance of payments is the exchange rate. An appreciation in the exchange rate means that the exchange rate increases. An increase in the exchange rate increases the real purchasing power of that currency, which makes imports relatively cheap and exports more expensive. This would mean that imports for that country would rise and exports for that country would fall because they are more expensive for foreigners. This would cause the balance of payments figure to reduce. The opposite of an appreciation in the exchange rate is a depreciation in the exchange rate, which is when the exchange rate falls. This has the opposite effect of an appreciation in the exchange rate. A depreciation in the exchange rate decreases the real purchasing power of that currency. This makes imports relatively more expensive and exports relatively cheaper. This causes an increase in exports and a decrease in imports. This has a positive effect on the balance of payments. The figure for the balance of payments will rise. Another factor influencing the balance of payments is the economic activity in other countries. If other countries' economies are booming, then they have a high level of demand. This means that they are likely to suck in imports, increasing exports for the economy that we are focusing on. Also, the foreign countries who have a high level of economic activity will likely consume their own goods and services rather than exporting these goods and services. This means that the economy that we are considering will import less goods and services. High levels of economic activities in other countries have the potential to turn the balance of payments into a surplus, or reduce the deficit, or increase the surplus. Another factor influencing the balance of payments is productivity and productivity growth. If a country has a high level of productivity growth, with wages increasing by less than the increase in productivity, it would make the goods and services that are produced relatively cheaper. This would make a country become more competitive globally on price and potentially quality. This could cause exports to increase as goods and services are now relatively cheaper, and imports to fall as consumers will choose to consume domestic goods and services rather than consuming foreign goods and services. Here we have some concluding points. It needs to be noted that all of these effects depend on how a country's economy is structured. If an economy exports a lot of goods and services and this makes a large percentage of GDP, then this economy will be more susceptible to a downturn in global conditions. This is because a change in global conditions would affect this country more compared with one who barely imports and exports. With an economy that has a large proportion of its GDP made up by exports, a global downturn will cause a massive inward shift of aggregate demand and thus cause the economy to be affected by this global downturn. Whereas if the economy only exported a few goods and services which made up a small percentage of GDP, the inward shift of aggregate demand would be much smaller. Also, the balance of payments depends on the responsiveness of demand to a change in the price of both foreign and domestic goods and services. We need to look at the price elasticity of demand to import and the price elasticity of demand to export. You will never be asked to work out the price elasticity of demand to import or export, but they are good points to bring up in an exam. This is because the more responsive demand is to an increase or decrease in price of imports and exports, the greater the effect would be of inflation or an exchange rate change.